Well, first of all, good morning, church. My name is Pastor Anne Marie, and we're so delighted to have you in our 11:11 worship series this morning because we are starting something new. As you have seen already, we have moved things around a little bit, and that's because we're starting a new series called Worship Wrapped. And so what we're going to do is over the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at what it means to worship. We're going to see worship from some different perspectives, and so what better way to see worship from those different perspectives than to invite you to experience it a little differently. So I hope over the next few weeks, you might do something new in our space together. Maybe you sit next to someone you don't usually. Maybe you ask a new conversation or start a new question around worship. Maybe you sit at one of these tables. Mine is free if you want to come join me. But I hope that we'll learn something more about what it is that we're doing when we perform this act that we call worship. And so we're going to start this series this morning by noticing the actual songs that we sing. So we're not the first ones to recognize how important the content of what we listen to and sing is. I think for many of us, we rely on our smartphones for listening. We might have YouTube or Apple Music or Spotify, and we download music, we create playlists, or we just spend our time listening to all kinds of music throughout the year. And like any smart company, these services have noticed our habits. And so a few years ago, Spotify, one of the most used streaming services around the world, put out something called Spotify Wrapped. And it's very simple in nature. They collected all of the data that you put forth by listening to different kinds of music all year, and they put it in a very easily digestible and shareable format. So they might say, you have listened to 60,000 minutes of music this year. Here were a few of your top artists. Here were a few of your top genres. Here were your top few songs. And of course, because of the world that we live in, what we want to do with that information is share it on social media. And so you might find at the end of the year, people will post things that look like this to their Instagram or Facebook, and they are sharing with you what they have been listening to all year. But this is where it gets tricky. Because the truth is, what we listen to and how much of it that we listen to tells us a lot about ourselves, about what we value, about who we really are. And so sometimes we don't always want to share the truth of who we are on something like social media. And so sometimes folks don't want others to know, maybe perhaps just how much they listen to Nickelback or Creed. And so, I'm sorry, that wasn't a shot at anybody, but what they do is at the end of the year, they try to max out their listening time on other cooler forms of music. So that way, by the time Spotify Wrapped comes around, they can post something that is not reflective of their actual tastes, but will make them seem a lot more interesting or whatever, a better music proficient person than they are. And this is not something that just happens, once or twice, or is a couple of niche issues. This was an article in the Washington Post of people trying to figure out when Spotify was going to stop collecting data so they could make sure they could come off a certain way on social media. Because we know that what we listen to says a lot about who we really are. And this is true as people of faith, especially around our worship. And so that is what we're going to be doing in the next few weeks. We have our worship wrapped. So I've talked with the band, and they have put forward a couple of different songs that are our most loved, our most listened to, our most requested. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at each of those songs and see what they have to teach us about what it means to worship, about what it means to gather here together, about what it means, about what we value. So the first song we're going to be taking a look at is one that you just heard. It's called I Speak Jesus. And so if we're going to talk about what it means to speak Jesus, we're going to start with the place in the Gospels where Jesus is first spoken of. So we're going to find ourselves this morning in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. So as you know, Jesus is mentioned all throughout the Bible in various different ways, including the Old Testament. But what we find in the first chapter of the Gospel of John is that Jesus' identity and role is given to us in a really important and clarifying way, a way that will teach us why it's so important that we speak Jesus. So we're going to start there this morning in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." So this text might be familiar to you. We find it in the lectionary, which is the 3-year cycle of preaching the full Bible, every single year at Christmas. And that's because for John, this is the nativity story. Except in other places like Mark or Matthew or Luke, where you find Mary and Joseph and wise men and shepherds, here John takes an entirely different perspective. He starts with the beginning, but not the beginning of Jesus' life on earth, the beginning of Jesus as God. And he starts there with these simple words, "in the beginning." And if you're that first Jewish audience, the first ones to ever read this text, those 3 words will bring you back to a very specific place. Because there's another book in the Bible that begins exactly that way. In fact, it's where it got its name, Genesis, where it starts out, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And biblical scholars tell us that the gospel writer of John uses this language on purpose, because he's telling us something from the very beginning, that this Word, who is Jesus, who is the Christ, is changing our story. And it's not just changing our story now. It has been changing our story since the beginning. And what will happen with Jesus is so revolutionary that we need to go all the way back to the beginning to understand it. That this Creator God is coming to rescue and redeem and be with God's people. And nothing will ever be the same. So there's 2 things that we find in this text that I think teach us about what it means to worship. And the first one that I want us to notice actually comes from the structure of how this text is set out. I know that's why everybody comes to church. They want to hear about the structure of the Bible. You're welcome. But if you look at these first few words, you might find they're set up in a particular way. They look a little bit like that very first book of the Bible in Genesis, where that first chapter is set up like a poem. And in this chapter, in this little introduction to the Gospel of John, this little prologue, scholars tell us it's set up like a hymn. And I love that, because I think it tells us something so important about what it means to be people of God. John is setting up in his first few verses the themes that John will unpack throughout the rest of the gospel. He says, if you're going to read the Gospel of John, here are two things you need to know all about Jesus. He is God, and he's coming to be with us. And he takes those themes, and throughout the rest of the gospel, that's what we hold on to understand what will happen. But he gives us that revelatory truth in a hymn in those first few verses. And it tells us that when we find something that is worthy of praise, that is worthy of changing something, that is magnificent, our first response is to worship. We find that in God, we are created to worship. And so we hear this term thrown around a lot, but what does that word worship really mean? When we find someone that we believe is worthy, we worship. In its basic format, it means ascribing worth to something. Or if we want to be more beautiful or theological about it, you can take a look. We have some definitions from the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. Worship is something that happens whenever we intentionally cherish God and value God above all else. Worship is focusing on and responding to God with your whole being. Worship is seeking the kingdom first and keeping secondary things second. And worship will reveal what is important to us. And so N.T. Wright, who's one of the great New Testament scholars of our time, tells us that we are naturally made worshipers. That is something encoded within us that we want to give over our time and our attention and our gifts to something. And we all make a habit of that. But where we get into trouble is that even though we are made to worship, we don't always worship the things that are most worthy of it. In her book, Present Over Perfect, Shauna Niequist, who's a longtime Christian writer and thinker, describes a very relatable, in my opinion, phenomenon in which she tells us about a Sunday morning. She wakes up bright and early, and she gathers her family together. She makes sure that the kids are dressed, and she has breakfast ready, and they all eat, and they head out the door, and they make it to church. And the kids go off to where they need to be, and she attends a service. She stands, and she sings, and she sits, and she listens. And by the end of that time there at church, she has done some really important work. She's thought about her grocery list. She's thought through the carpool. She knows how she's going to open that meeting on Monday morning. She knows what they're going to have for lunch immediately after the service. And she has not worshiped. And I love that she shares that with us. Because for how many of us, that is just real life. We can attend service and not really be worshiping. Not us, I mean other people, right? And it was a couple of weeks ago, so I've started the residency process in the United Methodist Church, which means that I am preparing for ordination, and the short version of that is I attend a lot of meetings and I write a lot of papers. And so in one of these meetings, we had a group of residents all together, and our facilitator was a retired United Methodist clergy person. And she gave us a really interesting task. She had these residents, people who were going on to be ordained in the United Methodist Church, and she told us to do one thing. She told us to let ourselves worship. She said that she could remember being in the church, being in the pews or the seats, and thinking about everything else that could possibly be thought about, who they need to talk to or what comes next or the details of the coming event, and never have an encounter with God. And that's not just one of us. For how many of us is it all of us? All across our culture, we can find things to worship. We can worship our careers or our political ideals We can worship our families. We can worship our distractions. We can even worship our church. But that's not what we were created to worship. Because those things, as good as so many of them are not God. And that there's one who's worthy of our worship, and it's the one whose name that we speak. And so I want us to take one last look back at our text this morning. Because if we've learned that we are people who are created to worship, the other thing we need to know about worship is who we are created to worship. So we're going to start back with the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 9. It says, "The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." And we could spend our lifetime just on those verses. I kind of hope that you do. But here's what we need to know. In this little introduction, John is laying out who Jesus is and what is most important about him. That he comes from glory, that he was with God and he was God, and through him all things are made, but also that he has come to us, that he has made a way through for us, that he has made space to be with us through the power of God forever. And that brings us back to the song, "I Speak Jesus." So this song was originally written by a group called Here Be Lions, before it was made famous by Charity Gale. And I found an interview, and I love what they say when they talk about what this song means and how it came together. The writer says, "The songs on this project have a sense of simplicity, almost childlike," explains Dustin Smith. "As writers, we can have a tendency to overcomplicate everything. It is good to do our best when writing songs to describe Jesus in the most awesome and majestic ways possible. But at the end of the day, the words all fail to compare to his greatness. Sometimes the best thing we can do is say his name and be captured again by the wonder of who he is. These songs are simple truths that have become powerful declarations. Just speaking the name Jesus over our families, our communities, and our situations are the most effective thing we can do." Here's why I love that. I think it gets to the heart of what happens when we worship. When we worship, we are remembering who God is and what God has done. We are ascribing worth, giving praise, that sacrifice of our time and attention and gifts to the one who is worthy. And our song says, Jesus in our addiction, in our depression, in our fear, in the mountains, in the streets, over our enemies. And I love that it uses those words, because as people of God, we have the power to say Jesus into those situations, because we know that there is no place that we go that Jesus does not go with us. Friends, we read, "The Word became flesh and lived among us." In Eugene Peterson's translation of this text, The Message, he says, Jesus moved into the neighborhood with us. That's a God worthy of worship, one that we can find sitting alongside us in our addiction or depression, in our communities, in our families, no matter what it looks like, because the Word became flesh and lived among us. When we have that God who's worthy of worship, when we recognize that and practice that and lean into that, something will change. We have access to a peace that we cannot explain. We find the courage to find Christ in others. We're emboldened to stand up against oppression and violence in whatever forms they present themselves, because we're offering worship to a God who dwells with us. In the beginning of what will become the Methodist movement, a young clergy person named John Wesley boarded a ship to the American colonies. And he had packed quite a few things to go with him. He had some shirts and some Bibles, and he also had some dreams. He had some great dreams, the things that he would do in America, the churches that he would start, and the communities that he would form, and the things he would do in Jesus' name. But he wasn't quite as ready as he thought he was, because it was on the way to the American colonies that him and all the people on the ship with him encountered a storm. And it was a big one. And John Wesley looked out and he saw the height of the waves, and he felt the rock of the boat, and he felt sure that he would meet his end. And just when that fear was overpowering, when he felt like there was nothing he could do, it was then that he heard it. Another group of people of faith, a group of Moravians, were also on that boat with him. But they weren't found in the same posture that John Wesley was. Instead, they stood together and they were singing hymns of praise. And John Wesley writes in his journal that he wishes he had faith like those Moravians, that he wishes that he could worship like them. And it would take a couple of years, him failing in America in various ways, coming back home, having a sort of crisis of faith, until one day he finds himself at a worship service on Aldersgate Street. And he feels his heart strangely warmed. And he realizes that this God of the universe loves even him, that he has come to take away his sin, that he had come to be with him. And the recognition of that changes everything. Friends, that's what we do when we worship. We are people who are created to worship, and we have someone who is worthy of it. So friends, what is taking your attention? What are you tempted to worship instead of God? How can you grow further in your questions of worship? I hope that you'll look around over the next few weeks and you might do something different. You might experience worship in a new way, that you might see some of these questions on these tables. You might take them home or reflect on them or ask someone what they think about worship. This is how God has created us to be. And we have a God who is worthy of it. May it ever be so. Amen.